50 years of the Japan-ASEAN relations, the path of the Japanese diplomacy, and the prospects for co-creation. I am Kei Koga, Associate Professor at Nanyang Technological University, NTU, and then will be a moderator for today's webinar. This seminar is organized by the Public Policy and Global Affairs Program, School of Social Sciences here at the NTU, and then generously supported by the CREAB. So I would like to sincerely thank CREAB for making this happen. And today we are lucky to have the two excellent speakers on the topic of the Japan-ASEAN relations, Professor Rory Medcalf and Ms. Sharon Sear. Professor Medcalf is head of the National Security College at the Australian National University, and he's a member of the board of the National Foundation for the Australia-China Relations, the ASEAN Regional Forum Register of the Experts and the Eminent Persons, the Scientific Advisory Council of the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, and a fellow of the Australia Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for coming to the webinar.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you. And Ms. Sear is the senior fellow and coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center and Climate Change in the Southeast Asia program at the ICS Joseph Ishak Institute. Prior to the academia, Ms. Sear spent 15 years in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the National Environment Agency of Singapore. Welcome to the webinar. Before diving into the discussion, let me first set the scene by briefly explaining the history of Japan-ASEAN relations. Last year, 2023, marked the 50th anniversary of Japan-ASEAN relations. Since 1973, Japan and ASEAN have cultivated a strong partnership, beginning with the meeting to address Japan's synthetic rubber exports, which were seen as a threat to the Southeast Asia's natural rubber industry. Through successful negotiations, Japan and ASEAN were able to resolve the issue amicably. The initial talks were tense, but these dialogues gradually fostered strong bilateral and multilateral relationship between Japan and ASEAN. And this effort culminated into the famous 1977 Fukuda Doctrine, which emphasized three key points. The first, Japan would not become a military power in Asia. Second, it would build heart-to-heart relations with the ASEAN. And third, it would become an equal partner with the association, as well as facilitating the trust building with the Indo-China countries. And since then, Japan has become ASEAN's most trusted partner. And last year, to further solidify this equal partnership, Japan and ASEAN emphasized the concept of co-creation, a key idea for the future collaboration. However, not much is known about the Japan-Southeast Asia relations before the 1977 Fukuda Doctrine. And this seminar aims to reflect on the earlier history of the Japan-Southeast Asia relations, drawing on the work of the Professor Taizo Miyagi, a prominent Japanese scholar specializing in Asia, including Southeast Asia. And his book, Japan's Quest for Stability in Southeast Asia, provides an insightful look at this period. And then we will start our conversation on the basis of this book, and then discuss the present and future of the Japan-ASEAN relations. So to begin, I will briefly introduce and summarize Professor Miyagi's book. And afterwards, I'll ask the three questions to our two distinguished speakers. Finally, we will open the floor for audience questions. And just quick administrative note, if you have the questions while we are discussing, please type them in the chat box below, and then so that I can pick them up during the Q&A session. So on Miyagi's book, the main theme is to explore Japan's engagement in Southeast Asia from the 1950s to the 1970s. And this period was marked by significant events in Asia, including the independence movements in various Southeast Asian countries, the lingering effect of the colonialism, great power politics in East Asia, and the Korean War, among others. And Miyagi's core argument is that the Southeast Asia initially struggled for independence throughout the 1950s and 60s, as the nation sought to break free from the colonial legacies. During this period, many Southeast Asian leaders strategically navigated the rivalry between the United States, Soviet Union, and China to achieve their goal. After gaining independence, these countries entered a phase of the nation-state building in the 1960s and 70s, skillfully seeking economic assistance and support from the great powers while avoiding the falling under their influence. In other words, Miyagi highlights the agency and strategic actions of the Southeast Asian leaders in shaping their own futures. And at the same time, Miyagi emphasized Japan's unique position in this context. While Japan has historical baggage due to its wartime actions in Southeast Asia, it was also navigating its own diplomatic challenges in the 1950s. And Japan sought a distinct approach from the Western countries, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, despite being closely allied with the United States. So this gave the Japan a unique political leverage in both the great power politics and its relation with the Southeast Asia. So this is basically the nutshell of his book, Miyagi's book. And then now I would like to move on and ask the questions to the speakers. The first question is relating to Japan's past approach to Southeast Asia. According to Miyagi's book, the 1965 coup attempt against Sukarno in Indonesia marked a watershed moment for Southeast Asia. It symbolized the region's shift from pursuing the independence to focusing on the nation-building effort. Japan responded by supporting these efforts through the political and economic assistance, seeing itself as the sole developed country in Asia. And at the same time, Japan demonstrated pragmatism by shifting its support from Sukarno, who pursued Indonesian independence, to Suharto, who aims to facilitate economic development, navigating the political and economic turbulences faced by Indonesia as well as Southeast Asia. But the downside of this approach is that it may have affected Japan's trustworthiness in the eyes of the Southeast Asian leaders because Japan practiced the pragmatism rather than the trust to the particular leaders. So the question is, do you think Japan's pragmatic diplomacy toward the Southeast Asia was effective in facilitating the stability in the region, potentially at the expense of trust building? And how do you assess, I mean, more broadly speaking, how do you assess Japan's past diplomacy in Southeast Asia? So this is the first question I would like to ask. The Professor Medcalf, and then Miss Shreya later. So over to you, Professor Medcalf.
Look, thank you very much for the question, but thank you also for including me in this significant conversation. I think we don't do enough to understand, I think, the evolution of Japan's impact in the region, and I think in many ways the more contemporary settings, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and the strategic diplomacy by Japan over the past 10 or 11 years shows, I think, a continuity from that diplomacy of the earlier era. With the way I would approach your question, and I do want to bring an Australian dimension into this because I think I'm the only Australian in the room, but the way I would approach your question is firstly to sort of challenge the view that there is a tension between effectiveness and trust building. Well, there's not a contradiction. There's a tension between the two is the way I would put it. And so I think, history is our guide here. If you look at the way in which Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN institutions have developed over the past 50 years and the way that they have responded to the efforts of major powers to help Southeast Asia develop, help maintain a balance of power, help maintain stability. I think in many ways, the responses of Southeast Asian countries, and I say Southeast Asian friends because from an Australian perspective and a Japanese perspective, that's what they are. The response has been very pragmatic, very focused on really achieving development in a very diverse community of nations. And frankly, when it comes to economic development, these partners have been much more interested in results than necessarily in that core question of trust. I think the question of trust comes into play a bit more when we're talking about security relations, which we might come to a bit later on. So I guess a couple of points I would just add to the conversation. One is to say that let's look at trust and effectiveness as a tension rather than a contradiction. They're always going to be working together, and it's a matter of degree, not a matter of absolutes. Secondly, I think the historical record demonstrated the answer to that question to some degree. That is, the focus on pragmatism did not fundamentally damage trust between Japan and Southeast Asian countries. And this is where I bring in the Australian analogy, because in that same era, if you look at the 1960s and 70s, and really up until the fall of Suharto and the East Timor crisis in 98, 99, Australian policy followed a similar path. And in fact, from a purely moral point of view, we can question that. We can question whether the Australian governments of that era should have embraced the Suharto regime to the extent that they did, just as we can question whether Japan should. But in the Cold War context, it was understandable, and it did not, as the historical record shows, it did not fundamentally damage relations with the rest of ASEAN. Finally, looking to, and just as an interesting aside, one thing I found really valuable in the book was to learn that there was an effort at building an Australia, Japan, Indonesia trilateral dialogue in the 1970s, actually spearheaded by Indonesia. And that's a great idea that we might explore again in the future. So, my final point is, let's look at these history lessons and apply them to what Japan and partners are trying to do now, which is to achieve stability, development in Southeast Asia, a balance of power, but to do it in such a way that we're working realistically with the expectations of our Southeast Asian friends, who are going to be much more focused on outcomes rather than on trust and principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing up the Australian experience in the Southeast Asia as well. I think that's actually the more kind of like the important dimension to understand the Southeast Asia relations with the external actors, including Japan. Okay, so over to you, Ms. Seer Sharon.
Hi, good afternoon, Kay and Professor Medcalf, and to everyone who has tuned in. Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar, and also for instilling a discipline on me to read the book. And actually, I found it quite interesting as well, alongside with Professor Medcalf, that actually there was signs of mini-lateralism. What we call mini-lateralism today has actually been tried already back in the 70s in that example that he cited between Australia, Japan, and Indonesia. But looking at the book, I took a rather apathetic position on it, largely because all of the events that had happened, described by Professor Miyagi, had taken place before 1965, and that was even before Singapore came into being. Of course, Singapore was part of the Federation of Malaya, but reading these accounts was very interesting for me. I'm interested in Cold War history, but I've not actually taken an effort to learn from the Japanese perspective. So what we saw was that, Japan sought stability, right, in Southeast Asia by trying to influence those pathways of decolonization. But actually within the region, what I sensed was that there was a great reservoir of distrust, even all the way into the 1960s. So all of Southeast Asia, as you all know, except Thailand, had been variously colonized by the UK, Netherlands, France. So for the Southeast Asians, when they see Japan coming into the region, it was an extension of World War II, an extension of colonialism, and replacing it with Japanese imperialism. So although the diplomacy at that time can be seen as pragmatic in the eyes of the Japanese, it may not be so in the eyes of the Southeast Asians. Of course, I have no qualitative data to back up. I need to go a little deeper into the historical archives. But I believe this was a conflict of interest because Japan itself was an imperialist power during the war. Although the domestic argument in Japan, as Professor Miyagi in this book rightly pointed out, was that it had liberated the region from its colonial masters. In actual fact, those wartime memories ran very deep and is still considered as a foe by many countries at that time. Of course, now we have celebrated the 50th anniversary, and many of the surveys actually show that Japan is highly trusted as a partner in Southeast Asia. So it does appear that those wartime memories and the passing of the generations after World War II has helped to ease some of these memories. So back to the book, obviously there were big power politics at play between US, USSR, and Japan, in which Japan was also navigating as a post-war nation. And there were certain expectations that the US had placed on Japan to be anti-communist and being the developed country in Asia to lead the way. So in other words, I think the tension that Professor Medcalf mentioned is very real. And the tensions are actually caused by having to navigate between the three big C's. One big C is communism, the second is colonialism, and the third to me is actually containment, with the US's primary aim being to contain an ideological spread from the USSR and China towards the region. So navigating all of these forces was very difficult, and in my view, that constrained the effectiveness of Japanese diplomacy towards Southeast Asia. So some things really was not within the control of Southeast Asia as well as of Japan.
Thank you very much. I think like that's also the important point to that the Japan's kind of perception is not necessarily like the understood, and also like the Japan did not necessarily understand the how the Southeast Asian countries thought about this kind of imperial or the great power politics at that time too. So that actually brings to our other second question, which is relating to the current approach. And then I would like to particularly focusing on the kind of like the post the Fukuda doctrine. So as I mentioned earlier, the 1977 the Fukuda doctrine was became the milestone for Japan-ASEAN relations, and then its three principles resonated with the Southeast Asian leaders, and the essence of the Japan's approach became clear, focusing on depoliticization of Asia by emphasizing the economic engagement. And of course, in the post-Cold War era, Japan has engaged in the security talks with the ASEAN member states through the ASEAN-led institutions, such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, plus and then also the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting plus Japan informal meeting. But these efforts tend to focus primarily on the non-traditional security issues, which don't necessarily deal with the such kind of intensive issues as the territorial disputes. So my question here is in this context, strategic context, do you think the Japan's current emphasis of the co-creation, which was emphasized in the vision statement in the 50th anniversary of Japan-ASEAN relations, is a continuation of this economic-oriented approach, or has the Japan's approach shifted to include more strategic objectives? How do you evaluate Japan's current approach toward the ASEAN? So this time go the other way around. First I'll ask Ms. Sear and then Professor Medcalf later.
Thank you. Actually, if there's one thing that Japan got really down pat is the fact that the way through ASEAN's heart is through its stomach. So the economic approach that Japan has taken actually resonates very well with the region. And in the 1980s through to the 1990s, we see that Japan employed this flying geese model of engagement in Asia, right? And the model worked very well with Japanese large MNCs leading the way to the region. So the idea is that the lead goose will go into the region, followed by the smaller SMEs. And therefore, the region enjoyed 2 or 3 decades of substantial FDI inflows from Japan, and companies coming to set up operations here in the region provided capacity building, skills training, education, infrastructure development. And this model promoted an export-driven growth, with many of the ASEAN economies becoming part of this larger supply chain that was led by Japan. But the model also meant that it treated ASEAN as the kind of natural resource and human capital base, which Japan used to drive its industrial policies. So there was also on the flip side, a certain dependency that grew based on Japan's investments, tech transfers, and market access. So in that sense, I would say that this formed a kind of asymmetrical relationship between Japan and ASEAN. And since then, since the 1990s, early 2000s, ASEAN's economy has grown. After recovering from the Asian financial crisis, I think it's quite clear that now the economic circumstances surrounding ASEAN has changed. The largest supply chains now include China, and it's not only dependent on Japan. And in addition, Chinese economic influence is now very powerful and threatens to engulf the region. And we often hear observers talking about how powerful China's influence is in the region. So for both Japan and ASEAN, I see there's a need to bring about an economic balance and equilibrium between themselves and also between ASEAN and Japan, and also in relation to that with the biggest economic influence, and that is China. Co-creation suggests equality and mutual benefits. Is also a shift from this previously asymmetrical relationship that is based on hierarchy to a more collaborative partnership. Of course, this is not said. When you read the vision, it's a lot of high level sounding words and sentences. It is not explicitly said in the vision. So you actually have to understand a little bit more what the Japanese government is trying to get at. But when you read the vision statement, there is an emphasis on shared and common responsibilities, ensuring that common goods like economic security, stable supply chains, environmental protectionism are the responsibility of everyone, i.e., it's not just the responsibility of Japan. It's a responsibility of the 10 ASEAN countries as well. So it's a reflection of Japan's treatment of ASEAN as equal partners, a kind of recognition of ASEAN's coming of age, i.e., ASEAN is no longer simply a recipient. That was what it was before, 50 years ago, where ASEAN is a recipient of Japanese FDI, ODA, and all kinds of assistance, right? But ASEAN has come of age. So while the engagement in the past has been deeply industrial and trade reliant, this new co-creation partnership suggests that we will now begin to look at new and broader areas of cooperation, such as sustainability, social inclusivity, climate change, green growth, and of course, the use of new technologies like AI will be important. So I'm quite optimistic and hopeful that the next 50 years in our relationship, that ASEAN can also bring as much to the table as Japan does.
Thank you very much. I think you pointed out the importance of the co-creation, and then the co-creation, as you articulate, is the more kind of shared responsibility and equal partnership between the Japan and ASEAN. And then you are actually right, I guess, to point out that the ASEAN has grown like so much for now, and then there's gonna be more kind of like the equal obligation and then also the opportunities to share and then they cooperate together in the future too. So I think like this is a good start. Probably like the challenge might be a little bit more since this is asymmetric kind of economic relation has been there for a long time. So like how we gonna actually change our perception and then also perspective too. But then that's actually a really great point. Thank you very much. So next over to you, Professor Medcalf.
Look, thank you. And once again, I think it's a question that connects I guess, the sort of late 20th century approaches by Japan in Southeast Asia and the present day. And I think it's really important to look for that continuum. I mean, I think that, and it just occurred to me that, apart from I think the really useful book that we're studying, I think also that the work of some other Japanese scholars, I'm thinking of Shiorishi Takashi, for example, and Kanehara Nobu, who've also looked at that long arc of 20th century and 21st century Japanese history, that's a really, I think, rich vein of thinking for us to mine, because there was continuity. I think the point that has just been made about co-creation being a good idea in the late 20th century, but a living reality in the present day and in the future, precisely because ASEAN partners are becoming more substantial economic powers in their own right. And so there was always sovereign equality, but now, of course, there's a much more equal relationship in terms of strategic weight as well. I also, look, I would like to think that there was always a strategic current to Japanese thinking, but obviously that was very submerged for understandable reasons certainly in the post-war period, but also in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s and 90s. It will be interesting to see how the history books retell that story, because I am conscious that power politics was always an undercurrent in the thinking of Japanese diplomacy, and of course also an acknowledgement for the wrongs of the earlier war era and the imperial era. But it's only been, I think, in the 21st century, it's only been certainly with Prime Minister Abe and the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy that we've actually seen a Japanese strategic intent very openly articulated, and a recognition that building a strong and resilient Southeast Asia is not just good for regional development, it's also good for deterrence and stability. So I think that's the space that Japan is operating in today. And I guess we do have to be a little bit careful in assuming that every Japanese diplomat or every Japanese aid worker or business person in the 1970s understood that. I think there was leaders who did understand that was the long game. The last point I'll make as well, again, just to draw that analogy with the Australian experience, is that there was not a naivety, but there was a hope in the 1980s and the 1990s, and even the early 21st century, that we weren't going to be headed for another era of strategic rivalry. That as the old Cold War receded, we'd be headed for this era of cornucopian win-win growth for everybody, where the private sector would dominate. And it's interesting to see that even in the Japanese primarily economic policies of the Fukuda doctrine, there was an awareness that there were national interests that would need to be protected in the long run. So I guess this book is, to me, it's kind of it's revealing a hidden history to Japanese policy. And I think we can do the same for Australian policy, as a lot of documents get declassified on our part. But I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I think like another great point about the Japanese kind of the thinking, like strategic thinking under its diplomacy. Not only I think like the Southeast Asia, but also like the other kind of like regions as well. I guess this is a kind of like the tension probably like we are going to have, because Japan has seemingly like provided the economic assistance, which Sharon actually talks about the asymmetric relationship. And then their kind of focus is more on the economic development, even though they may have certain kind of strategic intention. But like on the other hand, like as the Professor Medcalf said, recently more like the Japan is kind of conscious about the strategic implications in the Pacific, and then they would actually definitely they are thinking about how those kind of Southeast Asian countries play out this strategic competition between particularly United States and then China as well. So yes, that's great idea. So now like we are actually moving toward the future of the Japan-ASEAN relations. And then my question or the future of the Japan-ASEAN relation is if you look at the 50th anniversary of Japan-ASEAN friendship and cooperation, they provided the vision statement that Sharon already talked about. And then that has the three main themes. The one is the heart-to-heart partner across generation, highlighting the importance of the human exchange. And then second one is the partner for co-creation of the economy and society of the future, promoting the vibrant and sustainable economy. And then lastly, the partner for peace and stability, emphasizing the rules-based, free and open in the Pacific with the ASEAN unity and centrality. So while fostering like cooperation is important, Southeast Asia, the Asia Pacific, and then the broader Indo-Pacific face a complex strategic landscape, mainly due to the US-China competition, and then along with the other regional instability in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, like the Ukraine war and also Gaza conflict. So the question here is in your opinion, does this vision statement, the Japan-ASEAN vision statement, help mitigate strategic tensions in the region? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of this future vision? Is there anything Japan and ASEAN should focus on collaboratively to contribute to global peace and prosperity? So these are the three. I mean, I think like it's a broad question, so you can actually answer or respond in many ways. But then if you could actually provide your view, that would be great. So first, going to the Professor Medcalf, and then later Mr.
Look, thank you. And I think it is really important to take our history lessons and then apply them to the future. So let's do that. Look, firstly, and Australia's also been through its sort of big anniversary of relations with ASEAN this year with a major Australia-ASEAN summit held in Melbourne. So we're having some very similar vision-based conversations about what do we want to achieve with our ASEAN friends in the years to come. Look, I think we have to be very honest about the context here. Part of that context is strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. A lot of that strategic competition is centered on Southeast Asia, and most Southeast Asian countries, understandably, are not in a hurry to take sides and are desperately seeking to reduce their exposure to the risks of that strategic competition. And that, in my view, is not just a strategic contest between China and the United States, but it's also a whole set of rivalries that surround China's rise and the way in which power has been used assertively, including against Japan, Australia, the Philippines, a range of countries. Having said all of that, I can understand the logic of Southeast Asian governments. They want to focus on internal development. They want to focus on connectivity. And unless they really have to, they're not going to take sides. And in fact, many of them would opt for a kind of hedging or even neutrality. So I think Japan has to be realistic about that context. And that's why when you say, I think actually quite challenging question, is a vision statement going to help mitigate strategic tensions? Well, not on its own. I mean, it's great to have communiques and vision statements and all the diplomacy that goes into trying to get whole nation states to agree on a set of principles for future cooperation and development. That's fantastic. I don't disrespect that. But none of this is going to be valuable unless state practice follows the commitments that are undertaken and the vision that's undertaken in documents like that. And I think the challenge there is really threefold. One is it's for, let's say for Tokyo, for Japan, it is about being able to consistently put attention and resources behind these relationships. And this is now a much more competitive environment where, yes, Japan is a major partner, but its resources are constrained. It has a whole lot of other priorities. And yes, there's a contest for influence with China, but there are many other partners at play as well. A second aspect there, it's not only about putting the resources in, but it's also, I think, trying to identify common ground in that vision statement where Southeast Asian partners can genuinely sign up to a set of principles rather than simply, agreeing for the sake of agreeing. And so I'm thinking, for example, about the principles set out in the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, principles like a rules-based order, like transparency, accountability, international law, non-coercion, non-use of force, predictability, equal sovereignty of states, all of that, and a way of recognizing that this is not about privileging the security agenda. It's actually about privileging the economic and development agenda, but ensuring that there's a stable security environment to do that. And so I think personally, Japanese diplomacy has to be very realistic about finding those areas of common ground and doubling down on those issues, such as international law, such as maritime law, such as capacity building, where it can actually put resources into play and make a difference. And then that goes to my third and final point, which is about an acknowledgement in Japan that you can't do everything and that you need partners, and that in fact, and this is me speaking to Australia as well, that none of us single-handedly have the ability to be ASEAN's best friend in its development and to give Southeast Asian countries options and alternatives for their development. We have to work together. We have to coordinate, but we have to coordinate in ways also, here's the trick, in ways where it's not a hard alignment of US allies on the one side, China on the other. We need to find ways where multiple partners can work together to give ASEAN countries options and agency for their development. Japan's in that mix, Australia's in that mix. I also think the Republic of Korea is in that mix, and that's why it's good to see the state of Japan ROK relations in recent years. We've got to help the Americans discover their best selves as an economic partner for Southeast Asia as well. There's India, there's Europe, and also there's the way in which Southeast Asian countries are helping one another. So I think as long as there's enough strategic humility in Japan's vision to recognise that that's the territory it's working in, and that the quality of diplomacy is actually going to be more important than ever. If all those things hold true, then I can say, yes, the vision statement is a good thing. Good luck.
Okay. Thank you very much. So that's actually really, again, like the important points. I think like the resource limitation that the Professor Medcalf pointed out is a really, really important issue in terms of the strategizing the Japanese diplomacy and engagement to the Southeast Asia and then beyond. And then in order to manage that, Japan can do by itself, and then for that end, probably the partnership is important. And then the whole purpose probably is to actually provide the options to the ASEAN, so that ASEAN has more kind of choice to pick up. And then so those kind of like I think the idea is also the important from the Japanese perspective too. So I think hopefully like in the future we could actually have the certain more kind of the strategic identity or like ideas about the Japan-ASEAN relations. But then from the different perspective, from the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian perspective, maybe like they would actually see the differently Japan-ASEAN relations. So over to you, the Sharon. Like, do you have the any kind of the thing that you want to emphasize?
Thank you. I think that I agree with Professor Medcalf that, a vision statement is just a vision statement. All of these words and diplomatic niceties make their way into a statement. But how then do you actually realize this vision that speaks to the heart of, operationalizing it, implementing it? And all of this requires cooperation from all of the 10 and soon to be 11 ASEAN partners with Japan. So back to my asymmetry point, right? If we do manage and all the stars are aligned, we get to realize this vision statement, I think there will be greater symmetry coming into the ASEAN-Japan relationship because, as you rightly mentioned earlier, Kay, ASEAN has gained more agency and autonomy, and they are now of sufficient weight collectively to create its own pathways. And this transition to greater symmetry is actually a natural one because it reflects the changing nature of geopolitics and geoeconomics, in which ASEAN should no longer be a taker or follower. As in, ASEAN could also play a part to shape some of these events. So, of course, within ASEAN, as you know, there has been frustrations over the ineffectiveness of the organization. In the State of Southeast Asia survey, which my team and I conduct every year, 77% of ASEAN opinion leaders say that the grouping cannot cope with this fluid political and economic developments, and that ASEAN is going to become irrelevant in the new world order. Another 73% say that it's becoming an arena of strategic power competition and its members may become proxies for major powers. So this betrays a worrying picture of the region from the elites. But on the other hand, there's another camp that says, oh, ASEAN should enhance our own resilience and fend off these pressures. So that strand of thought is that ASEAN must seek out hedging partners, and one of the natural choices would be Japan. Because Japan is, in terms of proximity, close to us, Japan is trusted and has been very consistent. I would say that in terms of, turning up at ASEAN summits, within ASEAN, we always compare who turns up and who doesn't turn up. Japan has been one of the very consistent partners that would show up every time. So the question is really how can ASEAN enhance its resilience and how Japan can act as a trusted and strategic partner. And one of the points that the professor mentioned, which is very important, is, having those principles that ASEAN can adhere to. And as well as me, the ASEAN DNA is really on, principles of international law and equal sovereignty of states. So one of the common good that we, as in just Japan and ASEAN, have both benefited from since World War II is having a stable international legal order. And maintaining the integrity of this order is very important for both ASEAN and Japan, because without it, we cannot maintain peace and security in the region that will allow us to feed ourselves. Again, the way to the heart of ASEAN is through the stomach. So we have to make sure that ASEAN's economic developmental goals continue to be met. And if we allow more and more countries to challenge the international rule of law by not speaking out against trespassers, including what we see between Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also the very, very complicated conflict in the Middle East, ASEAN and Japan will risk a rapid erosion of the legal order. So I feel quite strongly this is an area we can work together more closely. Yesterday, we had an ASEAN-Japan summit, which was co-chaired by Japan, and Singapore is the current coordinator for the next 3 years. And I believe that this is an area that both sides could easily find agreement on, which is to bolster the international legal order. I don't see that between ASEAN and Japan that we will have many areas of disagreement. Frankly, as Japan has no bilateral disputes with any of the ASEAN member states. Japan is equally concerned about problems happening in Southeast Asia, such as Myanmar conflict, the South China Sea. And in many of these areas, what do we need? We need rule of law. We need rule of law in Myanmar too. That's why all of these transgressions continue to happen, because there's no rule of law. So similarly, in the region, we need international rule of law.
Thank you very much again. Like the rule of law is the one of the principle that the Japan has been kind of pushing forward under the many for a long time, particularly under the free and open Indo-Pacific, and then also like free and open international order. So yeah, that's great. I think again like the follow up and then also the how we gonna actually achieve the objectives that like we stipulated in the vision statement. And then how we gonna implement our the action plan is going to shape what the Japan is going to have with the Southeast Asia in the future. So